The children appeared at his door every few weeks like some unspoken agreement had been made across the territory. They came alone in pairs, sometimes 3 at a time, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and stories that would make grown men weep. Silas Croft never advertised his ranch as a haven, never posted signs or spread word through the settlements, yet somehow they found him, the dusty, forgotten ones that nobody else wanted. Silas stood at his kitchen window, watching the newest arrival approach through the morning haze. A girl, maybe 8 years old, dragging a torn satchel twice her size. Her dress was little more than patches sewn together, and her hair hung in tangled knots around a face that had seen too much for someone so young. She moved with the careful steps of someone who had learned that sudden movements attracted the wrong kind of attention. This was the part that always twisted his gut. The moment before they reached his porch, when he could see the hope and terror warring in their eyes, hope that this stranger might be different, terror that he would be just like all the others who had failed them. The girl stopped at his gate, staring up at the house like it might disappear if she blinked. Silas had built this place with his own hands 15 years ago, back when he still believed his wife would fill it with the laughter of their own children. Back when the doctor's words hadn't yet settled into the permanent ache that lived in his chest. The ranch house was solid timber and honest work. Nothing fancy, but it had good bones and a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun just right. He opened the door before she could knock. The girl's hand froze halfway to the wood, and she took a quick step backward. Her eyes darted to the corral where his horses grazed peacefully, then back to his face, searching for something she could trust. "You hungry?" Silas asked, keeping his voice gentle. He had learned that loud voices made them run. She nodded once. A sharp little jerk of her head, but didn't speak. They rarely spoke at first. Words had been used as weapons against them too many times. "What's your name?" "Ilara," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "Well, Ilara, I'm Silas, and I was just about to make breakfast for some other folks who live here. You want to meet them?" Her eyes widened. Other folks, children like you, who needed a place to stay. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the careful mask she wore. "How many?" "7 so far. You'd make 8. He stepped aside, leaving the doorway open. "They're out doing chores right now, but they'll be back soon. You don't have to decide anything today. Just come inside and eat something warm." Ilara clutched her satchel tighter. Every muscle in her small body coiled to run. But something in Silas's weathered face must have convinced her to take the chance. She crossed the threshold like she was stepping into a church. Reverent and afraid, what she didn't know, what none of them ever knew when they first arrived, was that Bartholomew Kane had been watching the ranch for months, and Bartholomew Kane had plans for children like her, plans that would test everything Silas had built and force him to choose between the safety he had created and the family he refused to lose. The other children returned from their morning chores like a small army, their voices carrying across the yard before Silas could see them. Ilara pressed herself against the kitchen wall, her satchel clutched to her chest as the front door burst open. A boy of about 12 led the group, his sleeves rolled up and dirt under his fingernails from mucking the stalls. "Morning, Silas," the boy called out, then stopped short when he spotted Ilara. The others filed in behind him, a girl with bright red hair and freckles, twin boys who couldn't have been more than 6, an older girl carrying a basket of eggs, and 2 more children whose ages fell somewhere in between. They all froze when they saw her, creating a semicircle of curious stares. "Everyone, this is Ilara," Silas said, moving to the stove where bacon was already sizzling. "She's going to be staying with us for a while." The red-haired girl stepped forward first, extending a dirt-stained hand. "I'm Fiona. Been here about 4 months now." Her smile was genuine, but Ilara noticed how she kept her other hand close to her side, ready to retreat if needed. The introductions came slowly, each child sharing their name like they were offering a piece of themselves. Leo, the 12-year-old leader, the twins, Ben and Toby, who spoke in half-sentences that only they could complete for each other. Clara, 15, and clearly the surrogate mother of the group. Daniel, 10, who watched everything with sharp eyes that missed nothing. And finally, little Rose, barely 5 years old, who hid behind Clara's skirts, but peeked out with curiosity. "Where did you come from?" Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ilara looked down at her torn dress, then back at the assembled faces. These children bore the same marks she did. The weariness, the way they held themselves ready to run, the careful distance they maintained even while showing kindness. But there was something else here, something she hadn't expected to see. They looked fed clean. Their clothes were mended, not just patched together from scraps. "The road," she said finally. "Been walking for 3 days." "Well, you don't have to walk anymore," Leo said with the authority of someone who had appointed himself protector. "Silas takes care of us proper." "Better than anywhere else I've been," Clara nodded, cracking eggs into a large iron skillet. "We all earn our keep here. Everyone has chores, everyone contributes, but Silas, he makes sure we eat every day and have a roof that doesn't leak." As if summoned by the conversation, the sound of hoofbeats approached the house. But these weren't the casual rhythms of ranch work. These were purposeful, urgent. Silas's hand stilled on the bacon fork, and every child in the room went silent. They had all learned to read the difference between friendly visitors and trouble. Through the window, Alara saw 3 men on horseback approaching the porch. The man in the lead wore a fine suit despite the dust of travel, and his horse was the kind that cost more than most people earned in a year. His companions flanked him like guards, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. "Children," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying a warning they all understood. "Go to your rooms now." But it was too late. The lead rider had already dismounted and was striding toward the front door with the confidence of a man who always got what he came for. His knock was sharp and demanding, cutting through the morning air like a blade. Bartholomew Kane had come calling, and whatever he wanted, Alara could see in Silas's face that it wasn't going to be good for any of them. Silas opened the door with the deliberate slowness of a man who knew that hasty movements led to bloodshed. Bartholomew Kane stood on his porch like he owned it, his expensive boots polished to a mirror shine despite the dusty ride. His smile was the kind that never reached his eyes, the practiced expression of a man who made his living convincing people to make decisions they would later regret. "Mr. Croft," Kane said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Lovely morning, isn't it? Perfect weather for conducting business. Don't recall having any business with you, Kane." "Oh, but you do." Bartholomew's gaze swept past Silas into the house where the children's breakfast still sat cooling on the table. "In fact, you have quite a bit of my business living under your roof." Silas stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. The movement was casual, but it put his body between Bartholomew and the house. "These children aren't business. They're family." Bartholomew laughed, a sound like coins clinking in a leather purse. "Family? Now that's rich coming from a man who can't even father his own offspring. You really think playing house with a bunch of strays makes you a patriarch?" The words hit their mark, and Silas's jaw tightened. But he had learned long ago that men like Bartholomew fed on anger, used it as fuel for their manipulations. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. Progress, development, the future." Bartholomew gestured toward the sprawling ranch land that stretched beyond the house. "This territory is growing. Crockett, new towns, new railways, new opportunities for men with vision. But progress requires workers, young workers who can be trained properly, who don't have families to distract them from their duties." The implications settled between them like a rattlesnake coiling to strike. Silas had heard the stories from other settlements, children disappearing from orphanages only to turn up months later in factory towns hundreds of miles away, working 16-hour days for scraps of food and a corner to sleep in. The law turned a blind eye because Bartholomew Kane had money, and money bought silence in the territories. "These children aren't going anywhere," Silas said. "Oh, but they are." Bartholomew reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "You see, I've done my research. This ranch of yours, it's not exactly legal, is it? No official papers declaring it an orphanage. No state authorization to house minors. Just a lonely rancher playing father to children who belong in proper institutions." Silas's blood ran cold as Bartholomew unfolded the paper. Official letterhead, government seals, legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign tongue, but the meaning was clear enough. "The territorial authorities are very interested in unlicensed child-keeping operations," Bartholomew continued, "especially when those operations might be preventing these poor orphans from receiving proper education and employment opportunities. I've convinced them that immediate relocation would be in everyone's best interest." Behind the door, Silas could hear the soft whisper of footsteps. The children were listening, probably pressed against the wood with their hearts hammering in their chests. They had all run from places that promised to help them. They knew what proper institutions really meant. "How long do I have?" Silas asked. Bartholomew's smile widened. "Oh, you misunderstand. The authorities aren't coming, Croft. They're already here." Through the morning haze, a line of riders emerged from the tree line, moving toward the ranch with the steady purpose of men following orders. The riders approached in formation, 6 men wearing territorial marshal badges that glinted in the morning sun. Their leader was a thick-set man with gray whiskers and eyes that had seen too many unpleasant duties. He dismounted with the weary resignation of someone following orders he didn't necessarily agree with, but would follow nonetheless. "Marshal Thorne," Bartholomew called out cheerfully, as if greeting an old friend. "Right on time, as always." Marshal Thorne nodded grimly to Bartholomew, then turned his attention to Silas. "Mr. Croft, I have a court order here requiring the immediate transfer of all minor children in your custody to the Territorial Authority for proper placement." He held out a document that looked official enough to fool anyone who couldn't read the fine print. "So I'm sorry, but it's legal and binding." Silas took the paper with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a rage so deep it threatened to consume him. The words swam before his eyes, but he caught enough to understand. Unlawful detainment of minors, failure to provide adequate educational opportunities, risk to public welfare. Someone had paid good money to make this document look legitimate. "These children came to me," Silas said, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. "Nobody forced them. They were starving, abandoned, some of them beaten half to death. I gave them a home." "And I'm sure your intentions were good," Marshal Thorne replied, though his tone suggested he understood more than he was letting on. "But intentions don't override territorial law. These children need proper schooling, proper supervision. Mr. Kane has arranged for their placement in excellent facilities where they can learn valuable trades." From inside the house came the sound of muffled crying. Rose's voice, high and frightened, calling for Clara. The older girl's voice responded, trying to comfort her. But Silas could hear the terror underneath. They all knew what this meant. They had run from those excellent facilities before. "Give me 1 week," Silas said suddenly. "Let me arrange proper paperwork. Make this legal. I'll pay whatever fees are required. Hire whatever teachers you want. Just don't take them today." Bartholomew's laugh cut through the air like a whip crack. Oh, how noble. The desperate father bargaining for his pretend children. "But you see, Croft, this isn't about paperwork. This is about progress, and progress can't wait for one man's sentimental attachments." Marshal Thorne shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on his gun belt, not in threat, but in the nervous habit of a man who knew he was being used. "Mr. Croft, I have my orders. The children need to gather their belongings. We leave within the hour." "What belongings?" Silas asked bitterly. "They came here with nothing but the clothes on their backs and scars on their souls. Everything they have, everything they are, they built here. This is their home." "Not anymore," Bartholomew said, signaling to his men. "Marshal, perhaps you should explain to Mr. Croft what happens to men who interfere with official territorial business. I'd hate for him to make any foolish decisions." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Silas looked at the faces surrounding him, Bartholomew's cold satisfaction, Marshal Thorne's reluctant duty, the hired men's professional indifference. 6 armed men against 1 rancher with 8 terrified children caught in the middle. But what Bartholomew Kane didn't know was that Silas Croft had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, and the lesson he was about to learn would cost him more than money could ever buy. The door behind Silas opened, and the children filed out one by one with the solemn dignity of people marching to their own execution. Leo led them, his young shoulders squared in defiance even as his hands shook. Clara carried Rose, who had buried her face against the older girl's neck to muffle her sobs. The twins flanked Fiona and Daniel, their usual chatter replaced by a silence that spoke louder than screams. Alara came last, still clutching her torn satchel, and the look in her eyes nearly broke Silas's heart. She had found hope for exactly 1 morning, and now it was being ripped away by men in fine clothes who spoke of progress while destroying everything good in their path. "There's no need for the dramatic farewell," Bartholomew said, checking his pocket watch with theatrical impatience. These children will be much better off in proper facilities, regular meals, structured education, valuable job training that will prepare them for productive lives in the new territory. Productive lives, Silas repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the words. You mean profitable lives for you? Marshal Thorne stepped forward, his face grim but determined. Mr. Croft, don't make this harder than it needs to be. The law is the law, and I have a job to do. But as the marshal spoke, something peculiar began to happen. A dust cloud appeared on the eastern road, too large and too organized to be casual travelers. Then another from the south and a third from the west. The riders weren't hurrying, but they moved with purpose, converging on the ranch like streams flowing toward a river. Bartholomew noticed them too, his confident smile faltering slightly as he tried to count the approaching horsemen. Who are they? He demanded. Silas's weathered face transformed, showing the first hint of satisfaction he had felt all morning. Friends, he said simply. The first group to arrive consisted of 5 men led by a grizzled rancher named Jedediah Miles, whose spread bordered Silas's land to the east. Behind him rode the Garner brothers, both veterans of territorial disputes, and 2 younger men whose faces bore the hard lines of people who had seen their share of injustice. "Morning, Silas," Jedediah called out, his hand resting casually on his rifle stock. "Heard you might be having some visitors today." From the south came another group, 6 riders, including a woman in practical riding clothes, who sat her horse like she had been born in the saddle. Eleanor Vance, the schoolteacher from the nearest settlement, had brought some of the local fathers whose children she taught, men who understood that children deserved protection, not exploitation. The Western Road delivered the final group, led by Sheriff Morgan Hayes from the county seat. His badge carried more authority than Marshal Thorne's territorial appointment, and his reputation for incorruptible honesty had made him enemies in certain political circles. Behind him rode 4 deputies who looked like they had been chosen for their skill with weapons rather than their willingness to follow questionable orders. Bartholomew's face had gone pale beneath his tan. "This is highly irregular, Marshal Thorne. These people have no authority here." But Marshal Thorne was studying the assembled crowd with the calculating eye of a man who had survived many years by accurately judging the odds. 23 armed citizens against his 6 territorial agents. Legal documents versus local justice. Bartholomew Kane's money versus the collective will of people who had grown tired of watching children suffer for the sake of progress. "Mr. Kane," the marshal said slowly, "perhaps we should reconsider the timing of this operation. Allow Mr. Croft to pursue proper legal channels for legitimizing his custody arrangements." Bartholomew's composure cracked like ice on a warm day. "You have your orders, Marshal. These people are interfering with official territorial business." But Sheriff Hayes had dismounted and was walking toward them with the steady pace of a man who knew exactly what he intended to do, and what he said next would change everything. Sheriff Morgan Hayes reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with official wax. "Mr. Kane, I have here a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, bribery of territorial officials, and conspiracy to engage in unlawful child labor practices." The words hit Bartholomew like a physical blow. His confident facade crumbled as he stared at the document, his mind racing to understand how his carefully laid plans had unraveled so completely. "That's impossible. You have no jurisdiction over territorial matters." "Actually, I do," Sheriff Hayes replied calmly. "Seems your business operations crossed county lines when you started moving children between territories without proper documentation. That makes it a county matter. And I've got 3 separate complaints filed by parents whose children disappeared from other settlements after encounters with your representatives." Jedediah Miles spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Been tracking your operation for months, Kane. Every child that vanished, every family torn apart, every workshop full of kids working themselves to death. We've been building a case against you piece by piece." Bartholomew's 2 hired men shifted nervously in their saddles, their loyalty extending only as far as their paychecks. When money stopped flowing, their commitment to Bartholomew's cause would dry up like a creek in summer drought. Marshal Thorne, meanwhile, was studying the warrant with the focused attention of a man trying to salvage his own career from the wreckage of corrupted orders. "This is what you were preparing for," Alara said, her voice filled with wonder as she looked up at Silas. "All those times you rode out to the settlements. All those letters you wrote, you are building an army." Silas knelt down to her level, his weathered hands gentle on her thin shoulders. "Not an army, sweetheart, a community. People who believe that children deserve better than being bought and sold like cattle." But Bartholomew Kane had not built his fortune by surrendering at the first sign of opposition. As Sheriff Hayes approached with iron shackles, Bartholomew's hand moved with surprising speed to the small pistol concealed in his vest. The movement was smooth, practiced, and desperate. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Rose from Clara's arms, the 5-year-old too shocked to scream as the cold barrel pressed against her temple. "Everyone back away," Bartholomew commanded, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "I'm leaving here with what I came for, and anyone who tries to stop me will watch this child pay the price." The assembled crowd froze, 23 armed adults rendered helpless by one man and a terrified little girl. Rose's eyes were wide with confusion, her small hands gripping Bartholomew's sleeve as she tried to understand why the nice morning had turned so frightening. "Let her go, Kane," Sheriff Hayes said, his hand hovering over his gun. "You hurt that child and there won't be a hole deep enough for you to hide in." "I'm taking her and 2 others," Bartholomew replied, backing toward his horse while keeping Rose between himself and the crowd. "Consider it payment for all the trouble you've caused me. They'll work off their debt in my factories and maybe learn some respect for authority in the process." Leo stepped forward, his young face blazing with protective fury. "You're not taking any of us." Bartholomew swung the gun toward the 12-year-old. And in that moment of divided attention, something unexpected happened. Rose, small and seemingly helpless, did something that would haunt Bartholomew Kane for the rest of his very short life. Rose bit down on Bartholomew's wrist, with all the ferocity of a wild animal protecting itself. Her small teeth found flesh through his expensive sleeve, and Bartholomew screamed in pain and surprise, his grip on the pistol loosening as instinct made him jerk his wounded arm away from the source of agony. In that split second of confusion, Clara lunged forward and yanked Rose from Bartholomew's weakened grasp, rolling them both away from the line of fire. Sheriff Hayes's hand moved like lightning, his Colt clearing leather and firing before Bartholomew could regain control of his weapon. The shot took Bartholomew in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the dust. Bartholomew hit the ground hard, clutching his wounded shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. His face had gone ashen, not just from pain, but from the sudden realization that his world of influence and corruption had collapsed around him in the span of minutes. "Somebody get Doc Miles," Sheriff Hayes called out, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly concerned about Bartholomew's comfort. "We'll need him patched up enough to stand trial." Marshal Thorne dismounted slowly, his weathered face showing a mixture of relief and resignation. "Sheriff Hayes, I need to inform you that I was acting on orders I believe to be legitimate. If those documents were fraudulent, save it for the Territorial Review Board," Hayes replied, kneeling to check Bartholomew's wound. "Right now, I'm more interested in making sure this snake doesn't bleed to death before he can answer for what he's done to these families." Silas gathered the children around him, his arms somehow managing to encompass all 8 of them in a protective circle. Rose was still shaking from her encounter with Bartholomew, but there was a fierce pride in her young face that hadn't been there before. She had fought back, and in doing so had helped save not just herself, but her entire makeshift family. "Is it over?" Alara asked, her voice small but hopeful. "Not quite," Eleanor Vance said, approaching with a folder full of official-looking papers. "But it will be soon. Sheriff Hayes and I have been working with the Territorial Governor's Office for months, documenting Bartholomew's illegal operations and preparing legal guardianship papers for Mr. Silas Croft." She handed the documents to Silas, who stared at them with the wonder of a man holding his greatest dream made manifest. "These make it official. You're their legal guardian with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. No one can take them away from you again, not without a court hearing and just cause." Jedediah Miles clasped Silas on the shoulder. "Of course, legal papers are just ink on parchment without folks willing to stand behind them. You've got a whole community here that'll vouch for the kind of father you've been to these children." As if to prove his point, the assembled riders began dismounting, their horses forming a protective circle around the ranch house. These weren't just neighbors who had come to help.
They were witnesses to the transformation of 8 abandoned children into a real family, and the evolution of a broken man into something stronger than he had ever imagined possible. But Bartholomew Kane, bleeding and defeated though he was, had one final surprise that would test everything Silas had learned about the true meaning of fatherhood. Bartholomew's laugh was wet and bitter as Doc Miles worked to bandage his shoulder. "You think this changes anything, Croft? You think a few papers and some local farmers make you invincible? He coughed, specks of blood staining his lips. I have partners in the territorial government, investors who expect returns on their money. They'll send someone else, someone who won't make the mistakes I made. Silas looked down at the wounded man with something that might have been pity if Bartholomew had been worth the emotion. Maybe they will. But you know what you taught me today, Kane? That I'm not alone in this fight. Sheriff Hayes finished securing the iron shackles around Bartholomew's wrists. Actually, Mr. Kane, you might be interested to know that your investors have already been arrested. Turns out, when we started investigating your operation, we found a whole network of corruption that went right up to the territorial capital. Your partners are more concerned with saving their own necks than protecting your business interests. The color drained from Bartholomew's face as the full scope of his defeat became clear. Everything he had built, every connection he had cultivated, every dirty dollar he had earned, all of it was crumbling like a house built on sand. 6 months later, the Croft Ranch had become something Bartholomew could never have imagined in his greediest dreams. The house had been expanded with 2 additional wings, funded by donations from families across 3 counties, who had heard the story of the man who couldn't have children but had saved 8 lives anyway. The legal guardianship papers hung framed in the front hallway, signed and sealed with the territorial governor's personal approval. Alara raced across the yard carrying a slate covered with careful letters. Her torn dress replaced by sturdy clothes that fit properly and showed no sign of patches. Silas, look what Miss Eleanor taught me to write. Behind her, Leo led the twins in from the corral, where they had been helping break a new horse. Clara emerged from the kitchen with Rose perched on her hip, both of them flour-dusted from baking bread. Fiona and Daniel came running from the creek, their fishing poles dragging behind them and their faces bright with the kind of happiness that comes from knowing you belong somewhere. Silas knelt down to examine Alara's slate, where she had carefully written family and block letters that tilted slightly to the right. "That's perfect, sweetheart. You're getting so good with your letters. Miss Eleanor says I might be ready for real books soon," Alara said proudly. "Books with stories about children who get happy endings." "Speaking of happy endings," Leo said, grinning as he pointed toward the road. "Looks like we've got visitors." A wagon approached the ranch, driven by a young couple with hopeful faces and careful movements that suggested they were carrying something precious. In the back of the wagon, Silas could see the outline of a small child wrapped in blankets. They were bringing him another one, another lost soul who had heard somehow that there was a place where broken children could become whole again, where a man who couldn't create life had instead learned to nurture it, protect it, and help it flourish. Silas Croft stood on his porch, surrounded by the children who had chosen him as surely as he had chosen them, and realized that his greatest failure had become his most profound success. He couldn't father children in the traditional sense, but he had become something more important. He had become a sanctuary, a second chance, a living proof that family wasn't about blood or biology. It was about love, protection, and the courage to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The wagon drew closer, carrying its precious cargo toward home. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.